Imagine standing in a field where the very air feels heavy, not just with the humidity of a summer afternoon, but with the weight of hundreds of thousands of lives hanging in the balance. History isn't just a collection of dates in a dusty textbook. It is a series of moments where the world shifted on its axis, usually through the sheer force of human will and the terrifying reality of conflict. Today, we aren't just looking at maps or numbers. We are stepping into the mud and the dust of the most brutal confrontations ever recorded. These are the moments where empires were forged in fire or turned to ash in an afternoon. From the ancient sands of Cannae to the frozen ruins of the 20th century, we are diving deep into the events that redefine the limits of human endurance. To understand the sheer scale of what we're talking about, we have to go back to the year 216 before the Common Era. Picture the Roman Republic, an emerging superpower that thought it was invincible. They had the numbers, they had the discipline, and they had the home field advantage. But they were up against a man named Hannibal Barca. Hannibal didn't just want to defeat Rome, he wanted to dismantle their soul. At the Battle of Cannae, the Romans showed up with roughly 80,000 men. It was one of the largest armies ever assembled at that point in history. Hannibal had significantly fewer, but he had a plan that is still taught in military academies today. The Roman strategy was simple and blunt. They were going to use their massive infantry to smash through the center of the Carthaginian line like a giant hammer. Hannibal knew this. He intentionally placed his weakest troops in the center, forming a crescent shape that bulged toward the Romans. As the Roman legions pushed forward, feeling victory within their grasp, that crescent began to bend backward. The Romans thought they were winning, so they kept funneling more and more men into the center, packing themselves so tightly that they could barely move their arms to swing their swords. That's when the trap snapped shut. Hannibal's elite African heavy infantry, stationed on the wings, swung inward. Simultaneously, his cavalry, which had already chased off the Roman horsemen, circled back and slammed into the Roman rear. The Romans were completely surrounded. What followed wasn't a battle in the traditional sense. It was a systematic elimination. For hours, the Roman soldiers were trapped in a shrinking circle of steel. Historians tell us that by the end of the day, nearly 50,000 Romans lay on that field. The sheer psychological impact of Cannae was so great that for decades afterward, Roman parents would scare their children by whispering that Hannibal was at the gates. It remains a masterclass in tactical encirclement. A day when the earth literally drank the strength of a superpower. But history doesn't just happen in the open fields of Italy. If we move forward several centuries and shift our gaze to the east, we find the Siege of Baghdad in 1258. This wasn't just a clash of armies, it was the collision of two entirely different worlds. On one side, you had the Abbasid Caliphate, the center of the Islamic Golden Age, a city of libraries, science, and unimaginable wealth. On the other side, you had the Mongol Empire, led by Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan. The Mongols were a force of nature. They had conquered more territory in a few decades than the Romans had in centuries. When the Caliph refused to surrender, the Mongols did what they did best. They engineered a nightmare. They built a palisade and a ditch around the entire city, cutting off all escape. Then, they brought out the heavy machinery. Baghdad, the jewel of the world, was pelted with stones and fire for days. When the walls finally gave way, the scale of the devastation was almost impossible to comprehend. It wasn't just the loss of life, though that was staggering. It was the loss of human knowledge. Legend says the Tigris River ran black with the ink of the countless books thrown into the water from the House of Wisdom. This battle ended a golden age and shifted the entire trajectory of Middle Eastern history. It reminds us that sometimes the brutality of a battle is measured not just in the people who fall, but in the ideas that are lost forever. Now, let's pivot to a different kind of intensity. Let's talk about the Battle of Tours in 732. This is often framed as one of the most decisive moments in Western history. You had the Umayyad Caliphate, which had expanded with lightning speed across North Africa and into Spain, now moving into the heart of modern-day France. Standing in their way was Charles Martel, the Hammer. Unlike the flashy cavalry of the Umayyads, Martel's Frankish troops were mostly seasoned infantry. They stood on a wooded hill, creating a literal human wall of shields. The Umayyad cavalry charged again and again, trying to break that line. It was a test of absolute discipline. In an era where battles were often chaotic, the Franks held their ground with a stoicism that defied the odds. They didn't have the mobility, but they had the position and the sheer grit. When the Umayyad leader was brought down in the chaos, the momentum shifted. This battle is often cited as the high watermark of the Umayyad expansion into Europe. It's a perfect example of how a single day and the stubbornness of a few thousand men on a hill can dictate the cultural and religious map of a continent for the next 1,000 years. As we move into the medieval period, the nature of brutality changed with the technology of the time. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 is a name that still rings with a certain poetic tragedy. Here you had a tired, hungry, and vastly outnumbered English army under Henry V, trapped by a massive French force. The French were the elite of European chivalry, armored in the best steel and riding the finest horses. They expected an easy victory. But the terrain of Agincourt became a character in the battle itself. It had rained heavily, turning the plowed fields into a thick, soul-sucking mud. The English longbowmen, many of them suffering from illness and exhaustion, took their positions behind a line of sharpened stakes. As the French knights charged, the heavy mud slowed them to a crawl. They became sitting targets for the storm of arrows falling from the sky. Those who did reach the English lines were so weighed down by their own armor and the mud that they were easily pulled from their horses. The sheer density of the crowd meant that those in the back were pushing those in the front into the mud, where many were unable to even stand back up. It was a chaotic, claustrophobic nightmare. Agincourt proved that numbers and social status meant nothing when faced with superior technology and a tactical exploitation of the environment. However, if we are talking about the sheer magnitude of loss and the industrialization of conflict, we have to look at the 20th century. The Battle of Verdun in 1916 is perhaps the ultimate symbol of the horrors of the First World War. It lasted for nearly 10 months. Think about that for a second. A single battle that lasted almost an entire year. The goal of the German High Command wasn't even necessarily to take the city of Verdun. It was to bleed the French army white. They wanted to create a situation so intense and so costly that France would be forced to pour every single resource they had into a meat grinder. The landscape of Verdun was transformed into something resembling the surface of the moon. Millions of artillery shells were fired, so many that the topography of the hills was permanently altered. Soldiers lived in trenches filled with water, rats, and the constant fear of the next barrage. It was a war of attrition in its purest, most terrifying form. There was no glory at Verdun, only the sheer endurance of the human spirit against industrial-scale destruction. By the time it ended, the casualties on both sides were roughly equal, and the front lines had barely moved. It stands as a grim reminder of what happens when the machinery of war outpaces the human capacity to manage it. But even Verdun is often overshadowed in history books by the Battle of Stalingrad. If Verdun was a meat grinder, Stalingrad was a descent into the abyss. In 1942, the German Sixth Army reached the banks of the Volga River. What followed was several months of the most intense urban combat ever seen. Every house, every cellar, and every factory floor became a fortress. The Germans called it the Rattenkrieg, or the War of the Rats. The conditions were beyond human comprehension. As winter set in, temperatures dropped to levels that froze the oil in engines and turned bread into blocks of ice. The Soviet defenders were ordered not to take a single step back. They held onto slivers of the riverbank, receiving supplies via treacherous boat crossings under constant fire. Eventually, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive encircling the entire German Sixth Army. The hunters became the hunted. Thousands of men were trapped in a pocket with no food, no medicine, and no hope of rescue. When the remnants finally surrendered, the world realized that the tide of the war had shifted. Stalingrad remains a testament to the fact that even the most powerful military machine can be ground to a halt by the sheer refusal of an opponent to give up, combined with the unforgiving brutality of a Russian winter. Let's step back a bit further in time to explore a battle that changed the world but is often forgotten in the West. The Battle of Salsu in 612. This occurred during the Sui-Goguryeo War in East Asia. The Sui dynasty of China sent an army of over 1 million men to invade the Korean kingdom of Goguryeo. This was one of the largest forces ever assembled in ancient history. The logistical challenge alone was staggering. The Goguryeo forces were heavily outnumbered, but they had General Yulji Mundaok, a brilliant strategist. He lured the massive Sui army deep into their territory, using scorched earth tactics to starve them. As the Sui troops reached the Salsu River, they found the water strangely shallow. They began to cross, thinking luck was on their side. However, Yulji Mundaok had built a secret dam upstream. When the Sui army was halfway across, he ordered the dam broken. A massive wall of water swept down the river, catching the soldiers off guard. In the ensuing chaos, the Goguryeo forces attacked. Out of a force of over 300,000 Sui soldiers who participated in that specific wing of the invasion, only a few thousand are said to have made it back to China. This defeat was so catastrophic that it led to the fall of the Sui dynasty itself. It's a reminder that nature, when harnessed by a clever mind, can be more effective than a million swords. We also cannot discuss brutal battles without mentioning the Siege of Jerusalem in 70 Common Era. This was the climax of the First Jewish-Roman War. For the Romans, this was about crushing a rebellion and asserting their dominance. For the defenders of Jerusalem, it was an existential struggle for their faith and their city. The siege was characterized by extreme starvation and internal strife within the city walls, as different factions fought each other even while the Romans were battering the gates. When the Romans finally broke through, the destruction was total. The Second Temple, the heart of the Jewish faith, was burned to the ground. The Romans, frustrated by the long and costly siege, showed no mercy. The city was almost entirely leveled. The Arch of Titus in Rome still stands today, depicting the spoils of Jerusalem being carried in a triumphal procession. This battle changed the course of religious history and led to the Jewish diaspora, a scattering of people that would last for nearly 2,000 years. It shows how the brutality of a single siege can echo through the millennia. But let's talk about a battle that was brutal in its speed and its efficiency: the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805. This was Napoleon Bonaparte's masterpiece. He was facing the combined forces of the Russian and Austrian empires. Napoleon was outnumbered, and he knew it. So, he did something incredibly risky. He intentionally weakened his right flank, practically inviting the Allied forces to attack it. As the Russians and Austrians saw what they thought was a vulnerability, they poured their troops off the high ground of the Pratzen Heights to crush Napoleon's right. This was exactly what Napoleon wanted. Once they had vacated the heights, Napoleon launched his reserve forces up the hill, cutting the Allied army in two. The communication of the Allies collapsed. They were forced onto frozen lakes, where Napoleon's artillery began firing at the ice. It was a tactical victory of such perfection that it essentially crippled the Third Coalition against France. Austerlitz is the definition of how psychological warfare and baiting an opponent can be more effective than sheer numbers. It was a day where one man's ego and intellect reshaped the map of Europe in a matter of hours. As we look at these events, a pattern starts to emerge. Brutality in history isn't just about the physical violence. It's about the stakes. In the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, the stakes were the control of the Mediterranean. It was one of the last great galley battles in history, where the Ottoman Empire faced off against the Holy League. It was a massive naval engagement involving hundreds of ships. The fighting was essentially a land battle on rooftops of wood, with soldiers jumping from ship to ship. The water was said to have turned a different color from the sheer amount of conflict happening on the surface. The Holy League's victory stopped the Ottoman naval expansion in its tracks, marking a turning point in the balance of power between East and West. Now, let's consider the Battle of Borodino in 1812. This was Napoleon's invasion of Russia. If Austerlitz was his masterpiece, Borodino was his nightmare. It was a head-on collision between two massive armies that simply refused to budge. There were no clever maneuvers here, just a brutal slog. For 12 hours, the two sides hammered at each other with artillery and bayonet charges. By the end of the day, tens of thousands of men were gone, and while Napoleon technically held the field, the Russian army had managed to retreat in good order. It was a hollow victory. Napoleon took Moscow shortly after, but he found a city in flames and no one to negotiate with. The brutality of Borodino was the beginning of the end for the Grande Armée. It proves that you can win the battle and still lose the war if you underestimate the resilience of your enemy and the harshness of their land. We also have to look at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. If Verdun was a French story of endurance, the Somme was a British one. On the first day alone, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties. It remains the heaviest day of loss in the history of the British Army. The soldiers were told that the week-long artillery barrage had destroyed the German defenses and that they could simply walk across no man's land. They were wrong. As soon as the whistle blew and the soldiers climbed out of their trenches, they were met by a hail of machine gun fire. The Somme lasted for months, much like Verdun, and resulted in over 1 million total casualties. It is a symbol of the tragic gap between 19th century military thinking and 20th century technology. But brutality isn't always about millions of people. Sometimes, it's about the desperation of a small group. Look at the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 before the Common Era. Everyone knows the story of the 300 Spartans, but they weren't alone. There were several thousand other Greeks there too. Facing them was the massive Persian Empire under Xerxes. The Greeks chose a narrow pass where the Persians couldn't use their superior numbers. For 3 days, the Greeks held off the Persian waves. The brutality here was in the close-quarters combat, the exhaustion of holding a shield for days, and the knowledge that they were almost certainly going to fall. When a local resident showed the Persians a mountain path that allowed them to get behind the Greeks, the end was inevitable. King Leonidas and his chosen guard stayed behind to allow the rest of the Greek army to escape and prepare for the next stage of the war. Their stand didn't win the war, but it provided the moral and psychological foundation for the eventual Greek victory. It shows how the memory of a brutal sacrifice can be more powerful than a military victory. As we move toward the end of our journey, we must look at the Battle of Midway in 1942. This was a battle of information and luck. The United States and the Empire of Japan were fighting for control of the Pacific. Unlike the ancient battles of swords and shields, this was fought across hundreds of miles of ocean by planes launched from aircraft carriers. Through a combination of code-breaking and sheer chance, U.S. dive bombers caught the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment, when their decks were full of fueled and armed planes. In the span of just 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were turned into infernos. A 4th would follow later that day. It was a stunning reversal of fortune. The brutality of Midway was realized in the fiery ends of those massive ships and the loss of the experienced pilots that Japan could never replace. It changed the entire course of the Pacific War in a single morning. History is violent, and it is often heartbreaking. But by studying these brutal battles, we learn about the limits of human capability. We see what people are willing to endure for an idea, for a leader, or simply to survive another day. These battles didn't just end lives, they ended eras. They drew the borders of our world and shaped the languages we speak and the cultures we belong to. From the dust of Cannae to the ice of Stalingrad, the story of humanity is often written in the moments where everything was on the line. These were not just statistics. They were individuals with families and dreams, caught in the gears of history. When we look back at these events, it's not to celebrate the violence, but to understand the profound impact they had on the human story. The sheer scale of these conflicts can be overwhelming. Think about the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, which decided the fate of Japan for 2.5 centuries. It was a clash of samurai clans that involved over 160,000 warriors. Houses were divided, and loyalties were tested in the heat of the moment. The victory of Tokugawa Ieyasu led to the unification of Japan under the shogunate. The brutality of that day provided the stability for a long period of peace. It's one of history's great ironies that sometimes the most violent moments lead to the longest periods of calm. We could also look at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, the turning point of the American Civil War. The 3 days of fighting in a small Pennsylvania town resulted in the highest number of casualties of the entire conflict. A failed charge on the 3rd day, known as Pickett's Charge, saw thousands of men marching across open fields into the teeth of Union artillery. It was a moment of incredible bravery and incredible tragedy. The fields and hills of Gettysburg are now a quiet park, but the echoes of those 3 days still resonate in the American consciousness. Then there is the Siege of Constantinople in 1453. For over 1,000 years, the city had stood as the bastion of the Byzantine Empire. Its walls were thought to be impregnable. But the Ottomans brought something new to the table. Massive cannons, including one so large it had to be pulled by dozens of oxen. For weeks, the walls were hammered. When the city finally fell, it marked the end of the Middle Ages and the true beginning of the age of gunpowder. The fall of the city sent scholars fleeing west to Italy, helping to spark the Renaissance. Again, we see how a brutal end for one empire can become the catalyst for a new beginning elsewhere. What stays with you after looking at these battles is the sheer variety of ways humans have found to confront one another. Whether it's the strategic brilliance of Hannibal, the industrial endurance of Verdun, or the technological surprise of Midway, each battle tells us something unique about the era in which it was fought. They are the punctuation marks in the long sentence of human history. As we conclude this exploration, think about the ground you walk on. Almost every part of the world has been fought over at some point. The peaceful fields and modern cities of today often sit atop the layers of these ancient and modern struggles. We remember these battles not because we love the conflict, But because we respect the gravity of what happened there, history is not just what we've achieved. It's also what we've survived. The resilience of the human spirit in the face of such overwhelming odds is perhaps the most consistent theme across all these stories. Whether it's a soldier in a trench at the Somme or a Greek holding a shield at Thermopylae, the courage to stand one's ground when the world is falling apart is something that transcends time and culture. These moments of extreme pressure reveal the core of what it means to be human, for better or for worse. So, the next time you see a quiet field or a monument, remember the stories behind it. Remember the noise, the dust, and the people who were there when history was being made. It's a heavy legacy, but it's one that we all carry. Understanding our past, in all its complexity and brutality, is the only way we can truly appreciate the peace of the present. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the moments that changed everything. History is waiting just around the corner, and there are always more stories to tell.